Hey everyone, welcome to this week's Azure Infrastructure Update. It is the 18th of July. Getting straight into it, new videos this week. I did a video all about the new Azure Monitor agent. This is obviously the replacement for the old Log Analytics agent, the diagnostic extension, the Telegraph, all of those now rolling into this new Azure Monitor agent and managed centrally through these new data collection rules. So I'll go into the detail on this. And when is it not the right solution and time to move to that? Also, I had my 60,000 subscriber Ask Me Anything session. That was a lot of fun. So the recording is available. As always, as we launch into this week's updates, a like, subscribe, comment, and share is appreciated. And hit that bell icon so you know when I have new content and do future live sessions. So let's get to the new stuff. So on the compute side, really focused around the Azure Kubernetes service. So the first thing we have is this event grid integration. I have talked about this before. So remember, event grid is all about the idea that, hey, I have this service that I can have various event sources, things generating events, and then event handlers can register to that. And so now that handler, instead of having to hammer polling that source, say, do you have something for me? Do you have something for me? Well, now instead, event grid will take care of actually notifying and calling that event handler. So the integration with Azure Kubernetes service is now, if there's a new Kubernetes version or a new node image version available, that for either one of those things I can now upgrade, it can now trigger via event grid some event handler, maybe a webhook that could actually go and do something around that. So I can now automate those processes. Then we have the new smart defaults. So if I think about AKS, there's a huge number of scenarios where I would use AKS. So there are different settings that may apply based on the scenario. And up to now, I've just got this very generic set of defaults. So what we can actually do now is if we jump over, so if I just go and now look at, hey, I want to create, for example, a Kubernetes service. So if I go to AKS, what we actually have is this ability to actually have some preset configurations. So if I now go to create a Kubernetes cluster, on the first page, you see you have this cluster details. And we see we have these preset configurations. And by default, well, it's just standard. But if I click View All Preset Configurations, you'll see we have these other ones. So we have Dev Test, Cost Optimized, Batch Processing, and Hardened Access. And it's telling you, well, based on what I pick, I'm going to have different configurations around the node pool node size, i.e. that VM that actually runs the pods that have the containers. Then it's things like, well, am I going to have auto-scaling? Is it a private cluster, i.e. the management interface is a private endpoint in a virtual network? Is it going to use availability zones? Am I having Azure policy applied? Am I integrating with Azure Monitor? As you can see, it goes through these different options based on what makes the most sense for those various scenarios. So a nice feature there to help me get started if I'm not quite sure, and I can still change those things, but it's putting in some nice defaults for me as a starting point based on my scenario. The no local accounts, again, this is in preview. This is the idea that if I have an Azure AD integrated cluster, I don't need local admin accounts or local accounts anymore. I can just use those Azure AD accounts. That basically gives me better security. So now during the setup, I can say, hey, disable local accounts. Moving on to the networking side, so now they've announced this Azure Bastion standard SKU is in preview. So the existing SKU we have kind of becomes this basic SKU, and the standard SKU is really designed around more premium features and larger scale. I can upgrade from basic to standard, but I cannot go from standard to basic. And if I think about basic, kind of the existing offering, it's really built off of 2 instances. And each of those instances, depending on the kind of workload, is kind of 8 to 10 concurrent RDP or SSH sessions. So with the standard offering, I can actually go from 2 to 50 instances. Now that's a manual scale action. It's not auto scaling today, but I can go and change, say, hey, I need 5, I need 10. There'll be programmatic access to that as well. So I can obviously get a much bigger set of scaling there. Additionally, there's going to be an Azure Bastion admin actual panel to go and turn on or off different features. So there are going to be different features that are going to be lit up for this standard SKU. On the storage side, so we now have this high performance cache. Now, this high performance cache has been there for a while, but they've announced some new features. So the first is now Blob NFS 3.0 support is in GA. So remember, Azure Blob, I can now turn on this NFS 3.0 access using the NFS 3 protocol. Now, the whole point of the high performance cache is it provides, as the name suggests, this high performance capability for high performance compute scenarios. I could have regular Azure Blob, I could have on-premises SANs or NAS devices, Azure NetApp files, all these different types of storage. And basically this service fronts that. It gives me this aggregated namespace, so a single directory structure, but gives me very, very low latency interactions with that, which then goes and talks to the back-end storage. So it's going to give me a better overall experience. So now it can also integrate with Blob NFS 3.0, that's now in GA. Also now, NVMe-based storage is in GA. So this high-performance cache is built on virtual machines. Now the regular one is built on the E series. So this is for this, and I think NVMe support is coming for this feature. But in addition to that, there are VM SKUs that have local NVMe storage. So these are kind of the LSV2 virtual machines. So also now in GA is an NVMe-based storage option for the high-performance cache. That's going to give me 4.5 gigabytes per second, 9 gigabytes per second, and 16 gigabytes per second. If I think, select that link, see if that opens up. It'll actually show us, hey, look, here are some of the updates, and it talks about, hey, there's that NFS 3.0 support, and some other options it's done. HIPAA compliance as well is another feature kind of they've introduced over here. Multiple IPs per NFS storage target. So these are some of the other features they announced. So I just wanted to sort of show these as well. But really the big one here was this kind of Blob NFS 3.0 support, the NVMe preview, and then just that kind of NVMe storage in general as over here. And it tells you those performances there. So a lot of investment around the high performance cache as a set of features. Azure Blob Container Soft Delete is now GA. So remember, this feature is all about the idea that, hey, I have my storage account, and remember, for blobs, we place them in containers. Now, there are various features available to let us do like soft delete protection for blobs, versioning for blobs. But what about if I do something at the container level? So if I go to my data protection, kind of over here, what we had before was for the containers, it was in preview. But we now see, hey, I can enable soft delete for containers. There's no preview tag anymore on this. I set a number of days of retention. So if I now delete the container for that number of days, I can actually go back and bring it back, bring back the container and bring back the data inside that container. So that is now GA. Disk pools for the Azure VMware solution. So ordinarily, remember, the Azure VMware solution are basically VMware hosts running in Azure data centers. They're typically hyper-converged. So the compute and the storage are part of the same boxes, and it uses virtual SAN to project that storage and make it available across the hosts. What disk pools now allows me to do is essentially it's going to create an iSCSI service. So it's going to create this, I can kind of think of it as, hey, if I have my kind of virtual network, so think of it as my VNet, it's going to take a subnet from my VNet, and I'm going to deploy my disk pool. So I think about, okay, I'm going to deploy the disk pool service into here. Now I'm going to delegate that subnet to that actual resource provider for the disk pooling. Oh, where's my ball gone? So that's going to get delegated to the resource provider service. And what it's going to expose through this, so these are VMs inside here that essentially are going to connect to managed disks. Now these will be shared. There's multiple VMs will connect to these for high availability purposes. And it will then expose it via the iSCSI protocol. So I'll see kind of a LUN 1, LUN 2, etc. And then my Azure VMware solution will be able to connect via iSCSI to that. So this solution is essentially creating an iSCSI target that's going to use the managed disk. Now they can be ultras or they can be premiums. Only those two today. I would use the ultra if I want that super low latency. But both of those support sharing. So I'm going to configure those managed disks for sharing so the multiple VMs that are actually powering this can connect to the disks, then offer that via iSCSI. So this is all built around today. I think it's DSV3 virtual machines will get provisioned. You don't see those. I'm just going to kind of provision the service. And if we look at the documentation, obviously this is preview right now. Try that again. Come on, open up. No, it's being stubborn. There we go. Takes its time. So if we actually go and look at the documentation, we can see the maximum number of disks we have in a disk pool, the maximum IOPS, and the maximum megabytes per second of the disk pool. So we can get some pretty nice numbers through this. Again, it's still following the existing networking we would regularly see. They've already got some nice documentation. It talks about actually deploying this. So right now we have to register our subscription for actually the preview. Then it talks about delegating the subnet to that disk pool's resource provider, assigning it permissions actually for the various virtual machine contributor roles, just creating a disk pool. I select kind of the types of disks I'm adding to it, and then enabling iSCSI on that disk pool, exposing the various LUNs, and then I can go and connect to it from my Azure VMware solution. So it kind of talks through all of those various components. So if I'm using the Azure VMware solution and I was looking for a different kind of built-in storage solution I could use beyond just that hyper-converged storage, that is now available in preview. I've talked about this in the past. ADLS Gen 1 is being retired. I can't create new ones, I think almost as of now. Want to move to ADLS Gen 2. Well, there is actually now a portal-based migrate experience in a private preview. So I have to go and kind of register and try and get on this. But from the portal, it will actually now enable me to do that migration process. It will kind of walk me through lowering that barrier to actually performing the migration. I'm just going to kind of consent, and it will go and migrate the data for me. Database side, Cosmos DB Insights and Workbooks have GA'd. So I've talked about these before. Insights obviously give me this curated set of information about my Cosmos DB instance that I most likely care about. And then those workbooks is this kind of more flexible platform where I can take it, I can tweak it, but it gives me different information about the environment. I can now use Cosmos DB as a session state and a caching provider. That's GA. If I have a web server, for example, multiple web servers, there's obviously a session state, and normally that's in memory. So I can't have multiple web servers handling a single session because only one of them has the session state. Well, with this solution now, I can actually store that session state in Cosmos DB, which will now be available to all of the web servers. I can even have control over the consistency model of Cosmos DB to make that maybe more available based on how it's replicating, how consistent, how quickly that's going to replicate across. And then the point of the cache provider is going beyond just web servers. Now I can just provide a cache for any application. It's just going to be, I want this performant but distributed is a key thing Cosmos DB brings me, caching provider. So you can go and dig into that if that might be a good fit. Azure SQL DB Always Encrypted has gone GA. So remember, this is all about the idea that, hey, we have that whole idea of kind of the secure computing, those secure enclaves built on the Intel SGX, for example, where the memory has a special partition that even the regular kernel can't get to. So what this lets me do is, previously with Always Encrypted, there were challenges to how I could use the data because it was kind of encrypted at the client. There was no decryption done actually in Azure SQL database because of the risks. If I use the secure enclaves, I can actually do an element of decryption now in Azure, but not risk that data protection. So now this gives me new things I can do, like in-place encryption by using that secure enclave. But also, because I can actually now do elements of decryption in that secure environment without risking the key, I can run queries against the data that previously were not possible when it was encrypted, because I can't tell anything about it. So now there are new types of operations available when I use this new capability with the secure enclaves. Azure Arc enabled SQL MI has gone GA, well, going GA 30th of July. Remember, this is all based on the idea that we have Azure Arc managed Kubernetes, any CNCF compatible Kubernetes cluster. Once Azure Arc is managing that Kubernetes, it can deploy other services. So data services are some of the first ones. So I think about SQL managed instance. I think about Postgres hyperscale. Will run on top of that Arc managed Kubernetes to now be an Arc managed SQL service. So that's evergreen. I bring other security solutions to that service. Well, that's about to go GA. And also just regular SQL Server running on Arc-enabled OS instances is also going GA. So for the just the regular managed ones, I think that gives me kind of some enhanced security. I can use SQL Defender on those things. So more services. On the miscellaneous side, so Azure Automation now supports customer managed key. I previously talked about Azure Automation moving to actually using, generally it's always the Microsoft managed key for kind of the encryption of credentials, certificates, connections, encrypted variables. Now I can just specify my own key in my key vault instead of the Microsoft managed key. There's now a built-in policy for centralized log analytics workspace deployments. That's now GA. So if I was to go and look at my policies, so if I jump over for a second, they have added this new policy. So if I just go and search for policy, and we look at our definitions, and the whole point of what this policy is doing is going to look for this centralized policy. So I'm going to look at my definitions. It's been a little bit slow today. Maybe my internet's still recovering from its its lightning strike last week. But there's actually now a definition for configure log analytics workspace and automation account to centralize logs and monitoring. So that's what I would see if this was actually going to respond to me. And that will actually now let me easily deploy that and have that centralized experience. So let's just, I could change the category to, for example, I'll put that on monitoring. If I can actually manage the mouse today. And like I say, if I just start searching for, let's try central, there we go. So configure log analytics workspace and automation account. So it's going to do the automation account to centralize my logs and monitoring. So make it easier to have a central configuration for my log analytics in my environment. And again, I just give it kind of the workspace name, region, and if it's not there, it'll actually help me go and create it. If it's there, I'll go ahead and use it. Next, so free extended security updates for Windows 2012, optionally R2, and SQL Server 2012 on Azure. So I think about those extended security updates. I'm now going to get it for longer for free if I'm running on Azure. Obviously, we want to try and get off of those if we can, but if you can't, I get a longer period of time. So Windows 365 was announced, and there were some Azure Virtual Desktop updates as well. So the Azure Virtual Desktop updates I've kind of talked about before. That was things like Azure AD Join, Start VM on Connect, a better, easier getting started experience. But the Windows 365, this idea of really a cloud PC. And now this is built on Azure Virtual Desktop. So if I think about ordinarily, we have kind of Azure Virtual Desktop. And there's different flavors of Azure Virtual Desktop. I think about, well, there's kind of pooled, where I have kind of a group of machines, and as I connect, I get allocated to one of them. And then there's kind of the personal. So the personal, it's kind of dedicated machines per person. Then there's kind of multi-session, where lots of users can connect to the same, and single session. So what's happening with kind of the Windows 365 is it's sitting on top of this, and it's really sitting kind of on top of this model. So it's personal desktops, it's a one-for-one. And what I'm really doing is moving to this per user licensing. So it's going to be a very predictable cost model. And I'm basically trading the control and flexibility of Azure Virtual Desktop for simplicity, because it's all managed for me. These do not run in my Azure subscription. I do not see these things. I'm using this as kind of a Microsoft 365 service. Now, there are going to be two flavors of this. I think there's going to kind of be this enterprise SKU and a kind of business SKU. The business SKU, I really have very little. It doesn't integrate with my virtual networking. I can't do custom images. It's very, very basic. On the enterprise, it's still a very simple experience, but it integrates with things like Microsoft Endpoint Manager. It can integrate with Defender. It does integrate with my VNet. It projects a NIC into my VNet, because this is a hybrid authentication. So it's AD and Azure AD, whereas this is Azure AD kind of only. This lets me have a certain number of custom images. Both of them are kind of Win 10, Win 11 only. It's no multi-session. Again, it's this dedicated model. But again, I don't see these. These are abstracted away. That run, the actual VMs run in a Microsoft subscription. I have nothing to do with that. So now I can just sign up on this per user licensing. Hey, I want this desktop, this cloud PC, and I'm done. So it's a very, very simple model. Now again, if I want the more control, Azure Virtual Desktop still might be the right solution. It depends on my organization, what I'm doing. But now, again, for very small self-service, I can just do the business kind of SKU. Super simple, Azure AD only, no really integration with anything. For an enterprise, hey, I can go this route. I can integrate with my VNet, so I could go and connect to other resources. It's hybrid. Doesn't use FS Logic for profiles for either of these. Because it's personal, it's using a combination of other technologies like OneDrive for Business, and there's certain types of roaming around the profiles that we can do, but it's not using FS Logic. But go and kind of look at this. There's a huge number of announcements around this. I think there's going to be some availability beginning of August to actually start kind of trying this out. But that's a cool announcement, a nice technology that really builds on Azure Virtual Desktop, but makes it a lot simpler and really usable by all. And then Azure Automation now supports a user-assigned managed identity. So I talked before about Azure Automation supported a system-assigned managed identity. So instead of having to have kind of run as accounts and manage those for my various runbooks, etc., I could now just use a managed identity, or now I can actually use a user-assigned managed identity as well, or for my Azure automations. So that's in preview. And that's it. So I hope that was useful. A nice collection of updates this week. Obviously there was Inspire, so a bunch of those were from Inspire. But as always, until next time, take care.